Hello, everyone, and thank you for listening to this episode of the Refold Podcast, where we talk about everything related to language learning. My name is Clayton, also known as George Pig, and I manage the community here at Refold. Today, our guest is Isaac, a heritage speaker of Japanese. Join us as we discuss learning a heritage language and what it's like being half Japanese. All right, hey Isaac, it is good to have you on finally. I think we were
Thank
gonna
you.
have you on in like season two maybe, and then we had to have a change of plans, but we
Yeah,
finally got you here.
yeah, it's nice to be here. Actually, nice to be in this whole podcasting and like have like the background and be and talk to all the people that I've been listening to for a while.
Oh, thank you. And Isaac, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and your background?
Sure. Hi, my name is Isaac. And in terms of like my background, I am half Japanese and also half white. So and I learned Japanese not as a. I guess the whole point is that I would be a. Some people would think I'm a heritage language learner because I'm learning the language of my family, but it's actually more closer to your average person doing Refold because like I did it something closer to like how a person learning a completely new second language would, since I didn't actually grow up speaking Japanese. So so I guess that's a sort of an interesting thing since I learned it from the beginning, starting from with like hiragana and all of that. So yeah.
Right. So you're a heritage language speaker, but you're on it's on a spectrum, right?
Hmm.
From being like kind of conversational in it to not speaking it at all.
Yeah.
And you're closer to having not spoken it at all.
Yeah, like I'd say like up until the middle of middle school, I can only count from 1 to 10 and say like really basic stuff like konnichiwa. Like that was the extent of my Japanese. So yeah.
So, what's your first memory of Japanese? Your father's Japanese, right?
Yes.
Okay.
My first
And what's your
memory.
first memory of the language? Like, when do you first remembering, hey, dad speaks something different than mom?
Hmm. I actually remember. So it was during elementary school, and there was another half Japanese person who I was in the same class with, and like we were walking to school together, and I remember my dad switching over to Japanese to talk to my friend's mother, and I was like, oh wow, this is a really cool language. Like this is not English. This is really cool. So just and I guess that's when I first started. I guess my that's my first like solid memory of like actually recognizing Japanese as a different language and a language that my dad speaks and a language that I don't. Since also my half Japanese friend, could actually speak the language, but I couldn't. So I was just like, sounds. This is really cool.
All right. And it's really common in some places for um, heritage speakers to be enrolled in like Sunday classes or something, weekend classes for the language. Was that ever you? Did your dad or your mom ever enroll you?
No. So essentially, because of a couple of things when I was like a baby, like it took me a little bit longer than your average baby to acquire English. I mean, I'm fine now, but back then it like because of like ear issues, and because I was having issues at that time, I think my dad specifically thought that I want to make sure that he at least gets English good. So we want to focus on that and not get anything in the way. Which of course, I mean, I mean, I do not blame him at all for thinking that way, but obviously that has the consequence of me not learning to speak it as a native language. So things that happen the way they happen.
So, how did you start actually learning Japanese for the first time then? You didn't start in school, you didn't start as a baby. So, how old were you? How'd you get into it? What was your routine?
Uh, I've had well, the earliest I could say I started, which I don't even know if I could say I properly started, was probably in fifth grade when my dad bought me a Rosetta Stone, and then I did that for a little bit, and then I wasn't really consistent. But then when I'd say like I actually started was a little bit closer like to the middle or towards the end of middle school, and that's when I actually like I mean I was actually quite a traditional learner. Like my dad bought me Genki. I did both the Genki 1, Genki 2, and I did the workbooks. I did everything. I think I did Duolingo for a bit too, and I think I did like the Anki 2K, like it's an Anki deck with like the 2,000 most common words, and like I was like just doing grinding that for a bit, and then I was doing that, and then I actually went on a trip to Japan, so like for was around for a week, and then like I tried to like actually talk to people, like do things in Japanese, and then I realized I literally can't. I mean, I could say a couple of basic things, and I could have very basic conversations with my family, but I kind of was like, hit with the reality that I basically couldn't do anything. So then I was like, I should probably do something, like I should probably change something up, like actually like take this more seriously. And at that point I knew of Matt, but I didn't actually like take his method. How would I phrase it? Like I didn't take his method seriously at first, and then I realized, oh wait, I think to actually get better at Japanese or any language, you actually have to actually experience that language in the first place. Otherwise, you're just like not actually doing anything. So at that point, I started doing. Oh yeah, I started immersing a lot in YouTube actually, and then like I would, ironically enough, I'd actually watch language learning videos about how Japanese people learned English in Japanese, and because I was like kind of in that niche of YouTube in English originally, and like I really like it's basically useless for me to watch videos of other people learning other languages, so I might as well watch those videos in my target language so I could actually get something out of it. So then I did that for a bit, and then I started going on to different Discord servers for language exchange, and then I started speaking with people and with a lot of different people. I tried to keep it mostly to Japanese people, but of course, you're going to see like foreigners. So I actually talked to a lot of people in Japanese, both native and foreigners. So yeah,
Nothing wrong with that. That happens with English learners all the time. I mean, if you think about the Refold community, are you active in the Refold Japan, the Japanese server?
Yeah, or some. I mean, I look at it. I'm not. I'm
Somewhat.
not. I'm not. Oh,
Half
are
the
you talking about
people
the
there are
subreddit?
Brazilian. Half the people there are Brazilian, and they speak English. So it's
Huh.
normal, I think. There's sort of this stigma around non-native speakers, but I think that's just a little bit of a holdover from the AJAT times, and it's a little bit
Yeah,
odd
fair enough.
behavior. Now, how far have you come? So you started with Rosetta Stone and Genki, and now you're at the point where I believe you told me that you talk with your dad in Japanese. Like that's your main
Oh yeah.
language with your dad.
Oh yeah. So like so yeah, now like actually it was a really fun experience being like I first wanted to like actually, since the closest native I know is of course my dad. So like I actually remember when I first tried to speak with him, like the conversation wouldn't last longer than a minute before we switched back to English, and now it's like, oh, we can just keep this going. This is really cool. And I've actually, what's kind of funny is that recently I've noticed that like sometimes he switches to English before I do, as in like, I mean, not because he's bad at Japanese, but I guess it's because he forgets he's speaking English, I guess, which is sort of an interesting thing. So like, I mean, that's kind of a cool thing to do, and it's also really nice that like I can actually talk to my Japanese relatives without him now. So it's like I can have more direct relationships with people, which I think is like pretty cool, and it's like really like it's like there's a reason for me learning this language, and it feels quite nice.
Speaking of your Japanese relatives, what is their reaction? Are they like happy with your level, or do they feel like it should be higher? Do they often make assumptions about your level?
Um, I only have like my in terms of Japanese relatives, I don't actually have that many, but the one that like for the couple that I do, they had basically zero expectations for me to speak Japanese. So even when I went there like back in, what was it, early 2018, I think, um, the fact that I even knew a couple of words and a couple of basic phrases, they were like, "Oh my god, that's amazing! What jozu? I mean, it's kind of a thing, but they were like,
You got
"What?"
Nihongo Josu by your own family.
Yes, and oh yeah, that's that's definitely a thing. But and so they were like really supportive, just like any Japanese that I studied. So I mean, I'm really grateful for that. But of course, like, I mean, it's one thing when they say like, yeah, new was also this, like, like you're making a lot of progress. But then of course, like if they say that until, I mean, they say that every time. But then of course they say that even if you're not exactly that great. So it's
Mhm.
very, I mean, definitely
Sort of a
motivating.
meme.
Yeah, it's a like I think definitely when Japanese people say it, they're not being cynical like at all. Like they usually like
They just
it's
have low
usually
expectations.
low expectations, and also like it also could just be like a way to start a conversation, because if you look foreign and you're speaking Japanese, there's probably an interesting story behind that. So yeah.
So, do Japanese people, when you're in Japan, recognize that you're half Japanese, or are you more white passing in Japan?
Um, well, it's been a while since I've been in Japan, and interestingly enough, like I mean, I don't think like my face or like my physical looks are what gives me away. But a couple of interesting things that I never really thought about is actually my clothes. Like because the way they dress in Japan is quite different. I mean, you're like, your average young person dresses quite differently than your average young person in America. So like I come in with like my American clothes because I live in America. I grew up with this. This is comfortable for me, and I think people could kind of like read my aura. I guess that like I probably wasn't exactly Japanese, but at least that was the last time I went there to Japan. The last time I went to Japan.
Interesting. So they can kind of tell based on like how you carry yourself
Yeah.
and other how you dress a little bit. Okay. I can definitely see it because like my stereotype of an American boomer
Mm.
is, like too tight t-shirt, really washed out blue jeans, and white sneakers from Walmart or something. And that's sort of my idea of like an American. I don't think Europeans dress that way, so it makes sense.
Or if it's a little
Um,
bit more modern, you have like the sleek like Nike pants with like basically the Nike look basically.
yeah. Now, how was the reaction of your parents, or sorry, not your parents, your family from like 2018 to now? Like the people who have seen your growth and development. Do you still get those? Oh, the Nihongo Josu, or is it different now?
They usually, well, it went from like Nihongo Jozu to like my grandmother literally telling me, what's interesting is that I had a conversation with her probably around a year ago or so that like she was like I want to start learning English too. I want to get better. I'm gonna watch. She was actually doing something similar to Refold where she really liked watching like old like old westerns like
Oh,
cowboy
okay.
stuff or whatever. And
Like my grandparents do that too, but they're, American. But yeah.
I guess it's an international thing. No, but so and she was like, I'm gonna try and uh, I'm gonna try and learn English so we can like work together or whatever. And then like a couple of months later, she was like, I give up. I'm leaving it to you to learn the Japanese for me. And essentially, it's actually really cool now that like we can have conversations about without her referring to the fact that like I'm American. Well, of course, a lot of our conversation topics have to do with the fact that I'm American because I go to an American college. The COVID situation in America is very different from the COVID situation in Japan. So those differences will always come up. But she would comment on my Japanese less. She would always say, you're so good," but the comments would come up a bit less.
And I think that's the trend, right? The better you are, the less overt praise you get.
Hmm.
Now, people make fun of us for this, actually, mentioning your grandma.
Hmm.
We've put out some things about like the gold list method, and I've tried to get Ben to make a video about the Lightner box system, which is like a spaced repetition system for paper flashcards.
Hmm.
And I'm assuming that usually grandparents are not the best at tech. But we've had some coaching clients who are in their 60s and 70s. And let's face it, things like Anki, Language Reactor can be a bit much. So definitely, if she wants to get back on it, um, I would be happy to help get her started on immersion learning in a low tech way.
Yeah, I mean that would definitely be better since I'm not even sure if she has an internet connection. So
Yeah,
yeah, I mean you'd have to like she'd be starting from like that low of a tech level, so that probably be the most
that's
effective
totally
method.
fine. I think it's normal. And that's one thing that I really want Prefold to be more accessible to is for older people because like
Hmm.
just think about navigating Anki settings and all the cool tools we do. There's another heritage speaker who put together this really cool thing about like whisper and
Hmm.
generating subtitles. And let's face it, even normal people who are in their 20s are probably not going to be able to set up whisper and use C++ or Python. So
Hmm. And even to speak to that, like I actually used to like I'd write my own scripts where I also part of like my learning history. I actually tried to use remembering the kanji, or more commonly referred to as RTK. Like when I first got started, and I actually would like write my own tools to like my own web scraper to like grab the kanji, like the radicals and the stories off of like kanji kohi, which is a website that used to exist. I forgot if it still exists or not, but at the time I'd use it to like to glean the information onto Anki cards, and like I'd format my Anki cards in a really like pretty way, and like I was into all that, but then I couldn't keep up with any of that. So I'd always be in and out of like I'd be doing Anki really intensively, leave it for a month, and do it intensively, leave it for 3 months, and then eventually got to the point where it's like I know this is a really useful tool that helps a lot of people, but I cannot keep up with this. So I just went the route of I look up words that come up and immerse. That's basically what I ended up doing.
So, with your immersion, what's your end goal with Japanese and your language ability?
As I've progressed, it's become harder to answer that question since when I first started, I had a pretty solid thing of I want to be able to speak to my relatives at the very least. That was like the bare minimum. And then I got to that goal, and now it's like, oh, I can kind of do this, though it's still kind of clunky. So I want to be able to do this smoothly, and I also do not want to sound American because a big part of my journey was that I did not. I hated the fact that I sounded American initially. Well, I mean, it's obvious, like everybody's going to have some kind of accent when they started, but for some reason, like I just hated that fact. And so then I did like part of my goal also was I want to sound 100% Japanese. Like even if I don't sound eloquent, I want to at least sound like a dumb Japanese person. So, and
So
now
does that
that
mean you think sounding native like is very important?
yeah, it was personally it was to me very important. And then
So
I mean
what are you doing to do that? Are you just listening a whole bunch, or are you also doing like anything like shadowing or chorusing?
uh, a large portion of my journey was listening. For a long it I kind of actually regret this. It took me a very long time to actually seriously get into reading, and that kind of stunted my vocabulary growth. But yeah, I did a lot of listening with YouTube and talking to people in places like Discord or HelloTalk. So a lot of it was audio based, but also I did specific work on my pronunciation, specifically as many Japanese learners would know pitch accent. I would There's a specific way called corrected ondoku or corrected reading where you take a text, you read it out loud, and if a native isn't there immediately, you record it and then you send it off for them to correct it. Or if a native is right there, you read it, and the second you make a mistake, they tell you that is wrong, pronounce this way, and then you keep going, and then you keep pronouncing until you get it right, and then you try to read it smoothly. So I did that. I did that
Right, we've
process a
talked
lot.
about the corrected reading method before on the
Mm,
podcast, early on. I
mm,
think Darius is a
mm.
big fan of it.
That, yeah, yeah. I'm definitely a big. Also, I'm very, very big proponent of it. Yes,
Yeah,
I don't think enough
so
people do it.
yeah, so it sounds like you've put a lot of work into your pronunciation,
Mm.
especially the pitch accent, but you feel like your vocab is stunted from not reading. Why did you delay reading?
Uh, Partially, well, a couple of reasons. Partially, I kind of bought into the whole Matt's idea of if you read, it's gonna stunt your pronunciation.
Subvocalization.
Yeah, which I'm realizing that even if I didn't read, I would have had bad pronunciation if I didn't work on it. So I think that wasn't exactly the best idea to follow. But also, reading is significantly harder than listening. I can I can put on a YouTube video, and also it helps that there's sound, there's things. It's like a little bit more engaging, and it's also a lot easier to understand given there's more avenues of getting information. So it was also just that reading was harder in the first place. And also I didn't exactly, it took me a while to realize that, oh, reading could be a lot easier if I read easier things, because initially tried to read like really at least at that time really difficult stuff like Ningen Shikaku, which is like a famous literary piece in Japanese literature, along with
Okay.
I think I tried to read a
You need to jump in with web novels and light novels, and I think that holds true across languages.
mm,
Um, they tend to be easier. When I
mm,
pull up Wattpad or something in Spanish, it's always heaps easier than published books.
mm.
And I imagine that shosetsu.com, I think, probably has easier web novels than than reading classic literature.
Yeah. That probably would
And
have been an easier way of getting into it. Yeah.
it's interesting that you do that because I've actually seen another heritage speaker. His name is Sean. He's a heritage speaker of Vietnamese.
Mm,
He would always jump into the most boring stuff. I would see him in the early days of Refold immersing, and he would be immersing in like stuff about the Ice Age in Vietnamese, and I'm like, what? What?
Why?
Why? Why? Like, I get it that Ice Age is cool, but it was difficult for him,
Mm,
right? Especially as a heritage speaker, he's a little bit more along the lines of someone who kind of spoke it
mm,
than your baseline, which is closer to zero. So he was a little bit more like advanced, but still, as a heritage speaker, I suspect that if you do have vocab, it's going to be a lot of vocab related to the house, the home. Perfect for slice of life content,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Now, have you taken any proficiency tests for Japanese? Do you have any plans?
Proficiency. I have not taken any proficiency tests, but I did just to fill a language requirement for college. I did. I mean, I haven't taken the class yet, but I was able to skip out of 4 years. So, or actually,
Oh,
like there's an interesting class on a I think it's called a translation seminar that like I really wanted to take because it just sounds interesting. But technically, I don't think I actually need to take it for the credit since they're like, you're good. You don't have to worry about this.
yeah. And then you do have the pera pera role
Oh
on
yeah, pera
the
pera.
chat on
Yeah.
the server. Does that mean that you talked with Matt?
Uh, I just missed that. There've been multiple people who've done the interview. I'm pretty sure it's Darius who does it now. But
Okay.
so first it was Matt, and then next thing there was a Japanese person who did it, and then that was the person who I did it with personally, and like we were friends on Discord, so like it was more of a casual chat, and then I think we sent our conversation off to Matt, and then we got feedback, and he was like, "Hey yo, yeah, good, you can have the chat now," and that's basically how that went. Yeah.
Yeah. Very cool. Now, speaking of Japanese people, I do think that Yudai Sensei
Mm.
is helping translate the guide into Japanese, which will be exciting. Maybe you can share it with your family.
Yeah. Mm. Actually,
So,
yeah. Sorry.
oh, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just about to say that I've actually also talked to Yudai a bunch, and he's also helped me with my Japanese pronunciation in terms of correction, and also given me good pointers of, hey, that's a little bit off. You might want to work on that type things.
Yeah, what do you struggle with now when it comes to Japanese? Just in general, it doesn't have to be pronunciation.
In general, I though I have recently been working on my reading, it's still far, far, far behind my English, which I want to at least, even if I can never get it up to my English ability of reading, I want to at least get it to a educated high schooler at least. I want to get it up to that level eventually, and uh, definitely another thing that I want to get better is just speaking more eloquently. It's not exactly something I'm great at in English either, but sometimes I feel that like my Japanese, depending on the time, sometimes it flows really nicely, and sometimes I just like sound like I'm stopping at every, well, not quite at every word, but it doesn't exactly sound nice, and so it'd just be nice just to be able to at least sound more intelligent if I wanted to.
Okay. So right now you want to sound more eloquent. You don't want to sound like a caveman.
Yeah. Then again,
And
it's nothing I can get better at it as at English at well. So I mean,
some people are just awkward in any language.
mm.
Not saying you're awkward because you're not. Actually, I think you're doing quite fine. But um, some people they just have this prosody and this way of thinking where you can tell when they have a thought block and they don't do very well when it comes to sounding fluid or
Mm.
fluent in a language, even if it's their native language. So I understand. Speaking is a skill.
It is indeed, and I've noticed that like you seem very fluent, given that you've done this podcast for quite a while now. Like you seem
Yes.
to know what you're doing.
I also cheat. I also pre-prep a lot of questions for the guests. As you know, I sent you some.
Yeah.
That way I don't run out of things to talk about. Um, so I also sort of cheat. I take, 10, 15 minutes before the podcast to jot things down and say, okay, what's a good question for this guest? Give them the best stuff.
Hmm.
So, and I've also been on camera. I used to teach remotely and
Ah,
I'm used to being on camera and stuff.
I see.
Now, you didn't attend any language programs as a child, but if you were to have a child, how would you raise them to be bilingual? What would you do?
Uh, of course it depends on who the other parent is, because if they have a language that's not English, I also want to make sure that they learn it too, because I think it's a wonderful gift of being able to give your language to a child. Um, in terms of Japanese, I'm not 100% sure if I would speak to them in Japanese, because it is not my native language, but I might, or I honestly don't know. I actually never thought about this, but uh, no, I mean, I would definitely try and get if I can't speak to them directly, I would either expose them to a community of speakers. Like, for example, like I might tell my dad, "Hey, you're the grandpa now. Only speak to my kid in Japanese, so he actually picks up this language." Or I might send him to a Japanese school. At least if we're only talking about Japanese. I might also, I think this is also definitely probably helped me with my Japanese. But my dad, at a very young age, got me into anime. He was like, it wasn't like just pop culture. It was actually he introduced the entire concept to me. So I would definitely at least try to get my kid hooked on Japanese content or whatever content that
And I'm
that they
curious,
end
'cause
up.
I imagine the anime popular among Japanese dads is different than the anime that's popular among teenage weebs.
Of
So
course.
what were some of the anime your dad liked and showed to you as a kid?
We watched a lot of Naruto. Like we like
Watched a lot of Naruto.
we actually ended up watching all of the original and all of Naruto Shippuden, which is which is a couple
How
of
about any of the classics like Astro Boy?
I think we watched the movies when I was young. I don't have clear memories, but like we actually have the DVDs, I think, still.
Okay. So what sort of anime does your dad like?
Um, at least the animes that we watch together, since that's a thing we do. We like watch anime together. We watch mostly shonens, I'd say.
Okay. Now that's interesting because shonen gets a bad rep among a lot of uh, a lot of weebs, people who like anime, for being like sort of like fight heavy and childish characters because it's aimed
Hmm.
at young boys. So it's interesting to me that your dad uh, likes shonen despite his presumably advanced age.
Yes. I mean, it also definitely helps that like we enjoy it. We enjoy watching it together. And it's something we've done for a while, so it's like it's a nice habit that we have together, I'd say.
Is he into any of the other stuff like Common Rider, like the sort of
He, it,
costumed warrior type thing?
interestingly enough, so that actually just like revived like a pretty primordial memory. But like he actually showed that to me, and like I used to watch it like when I was like probably like 5 years old. Like we used to watch it together on like this really old PC we had. So he definitely watched that kind of stuff too. So, or at least we watched it together.
Very cool. And to take it back to the question about raising a child, I've heard of something called OPAL, one
Hmm.
parent, one language, which is where one parent speaks. So if your parents were to have done it, your mom would have spoken English and your dad would have spoken Japanese. And I think that could be really cool. I expect there to be a generation of bilingual children coming from Refold. When you're older and settle down, hopefully you will also teach your kids their heritage languages, whether it's English and Japanese or something else.
Hmm.
Now,
Yeah.
looking here,
Hmm.
yeah. So, have you ever avoided speaking Japanese? Have you ever felt there was an opportunity to speak it and you avoided it for some reason, either shame or embarrassment, or you didn't want to be teased?
Hmm. I wouldn't say I actively avoided it, but there were definitely there are times and places that where I would speak less. Like this is also one thing I want to get better at in general, but it's very different with talking one on one with a Japanese person, which I'm perfectly fine with, or like small groups. But when it comes to big group calls in Japanese, where not only is what you're saying like not being able to just say interesting stuff, but also being able to say it quickly and on time and say it in a way that's interesting. That's something that's even difficult for native speakers. So that's definitely something that I still struggle with. And in those instances, I tend to speak a little bit less than when I speak to people one on one or in small groups. So I guess there's
Okay.
that. But in terms of, I've always tried to like use Japanese because I thought it was like it's a really cool thing, and just to think that like I'm getting better at speaking a language that's not even my native, that's super different from my native. And it just I feel there's something very satisfying to know that your brain is flexible enough to jump between these two languages and actually be able to effectively communicate with them.
Okay. Now, I'm going to shift gears here and I'm going to talk a little bit less about language and more about identity.
Hmm.
So, how do you identify culturally? Do you just identify as an American who happens to have Japanese roots? Or how do you identify?
Interesting. This has actually changed throughout the years. So uh, before I before I studied Japanese, I actually identified more with Japanese culture than I do now, because I think I had like I was always, even since I was a kid, I was super into things like like samurai, ninja. I thought like old Japan was like the coolest thing ever, and I was like so proud to kind of think that I came from that culture. And I mean, I'm not that I don't think that's cool anymore, but I realize now that since I've actually learned the language, there's so many parts of me that since I quite literally grew up in the States that make me American. So I've come to realize I'm, I mean, kind of obvious when I say it, but I'm much more American than I am Japanese. However, um, I parts of Japanese identity have definitely started to come in more recently because when you learn the language, there's like certain phrase. I'm sure this happens to any and all languages, but there are phrases that are very easy to use, but also reflect a cultural view. And as that's entered my vocabulary and I've started using it more often, like I feel like I've like not exactly created a new identity, but I've discovered a new part of it. I'm
Okay,
pretty sure like
interesting.
Rico Imperiello, the polyglot, said something along the lines of when we learn new languages, we don't create new identities, we discover more identities within ourselves. And I definitely feel like that's my personal experience.
Interesting. So you kind of it's a mixed bag. Would you say that you feel more attached to Japan now as sort of an adult than you did as a child, or less so because you speak the language now, but you've also realized just how American you are? And I'll give an example. I'm from the South, and I don't feel Southern when I'm talking to other Southerners. But when I compare myself to the Canadians and the West Coasters who work at Refold, I'm like, wow, I'm really polite, and wow, I'm really soft spoken, and all of that sort of comes to head. Or when I compare myself to other foreigners because I live abroad, things like that, I'm like, wow, I feel really Southern outside of the South. But then when I'm in the South, I don't drive a pickup truck. I don't have dip. I don't. So it's sort of a weird feeling. So how does your sort of cultural identity, your feelings line up with that?
I mean, I definitely feel that, for example, like it definitely, of course, like I'm pretty sure this applies to everyone, but it also depends on the people surrounding me. So when I'm around like only Americans, I could definitely feel that like my Japanese bits are stronger since there are quite, for example, like if I've been listening to Japanese for a while, Japanese phrases come up before English phrases, and then I have to realize they will not understand this. Let me actually think of the English for this. So that definitely happens, um, and of course, there's just like there's just cultural tidbits. There's like of course like there's like there's the memes in Japan are very different than the memes in like English speaking areas of the world. So that's definitely one thing. So I definitely feel that like I definitely feel more in the in group of Americans, but I sometimes feel like there's so much I want to show, there's so much I want to talk about, but they wouldn't but since they don't speak the language or they've been exposed to that, they wouldn't be able to understand. But then same thing happens when I'm with Japanese people, where I mean it's definitely a bit different because I didn't grow up in Japan, and there's a lot of cultural experiences growing up there that I just do not have, and I don't think I ever will be able to relate to. But I definitely feel sometimes that like I feel a Japanese part of me, but then as the conversation goes on, I definitely feel like I want to like is when I want to like introduce what I'm interested in, like talk about my interests, talk about like my passions. It's a very I can definitely feel a very American part of me since a lot of it is like highly either like embedded into American culture or has to do with like something that could only ever be a thing if it happened in English. So
Okay. Yeah, it sounds a bit like. Have you ever heard the term third culture kid?
I've heard the term, but I'm not super familiar
I
with
think
it.
it usually applies to people whose parents are both from one cultural background, but I think it might be able to apply to, people from mixed backgrounds as well. I'm not really sure. That's outside of the scope of my my knowledge, but it sounds to me like you definitely identify with bits and bobs from both cultures or multiple cultures.
Hmm. I actually I quite like that description. Identify with bips and bops. I definitely feel that's my experience.
So, growing up, did your family have any unique traditions that were sort of different from the Americans around you that your dad might have kept?
Um, a couple of things, I guess, since uh, I didn't realize this wasn't super normal until I started going to other people's houses when I was a kid. But of course, we take our shoes off
So
when
the
we go into
shoes.
them. Yeah,
Yeah.
and
Yeah. I've been in like condominiums in Asia where they have signs up saying do not leave your shoes in the hallway because people will trip on them.
mm,
Because so many people have that embedded just all across Asia, from the Philippines to Indonesia to Japan to China. People are taking their shoes off,
yeah,
and I've actually seen signage just like, "Please bring your shoes inside." Now, you don't have to wear them inside; you can take them off, but put a shoe rack up because otherwise there's just heaps and heaps of them.
mm,
So beyond the shoes, anything else like maybe food wise? So like I grew up with family from different parts of so I'm from Kentucky,
mm,
but I've got family from the deep south. I've got family from Canada, and the food is different.
mm,
So, like, one thing, a lot of Louisiana cuisine uses a lot of rice. So I grew up eating a lot of like rice and beans, or like mixed rice dishes, spicy food,
mm.
whereas Kentucky food tends to be much more mild, tends to be potatoes and corn. Any other things like that that you grew up with?
Well, funnily enough, actually, this is also another reason why I couldn't feel like I could 100% embody Japanese culture because I actually can't eat most Japanese food since I'm allergic to sesame. I mean, that
You're
also
allergic to sesame.
yes,
Oh man.
which also makes it so that I can't actually eat most Asian foods or Middle Eastern foods. So that definitely kind of threw a huge wrench into the whole thing too. So like I wasn't able to recently. I've actually been able to like at least like my dad is like we've started making more Japanese food at home. Like I remember like we made like onigiri today together, and we ate it and it's like, oh, this feels really nice, and like starting to eat more Japanese dishes like a oyakodon, which is like it's like a egg and chicken dish, and slowly we're introducing more and more foods. But the thing is, because I can't eat out, that involves us cooking, which I don't do too often. So I feel like my exposure to Japanese food is quite limited.
Okay. And were there any like holidays maybe that your dad celebrated that were not celebrated by people around you?
Um, I, I well, of course, on New Year's we'd always call our relatives, but that's I think that's pretty common across cultures. But what we would do actually, it kind of got messed up because of COVID. Uh, there would be there'd be a local sakura matsuri, which is essentially well, it makes more sense in Japan because you like there'd be a season where the sakura trees would blossom and all the petals would come down and it would look really pretty. It works a little bit less in America, but there's a couple of areas like if you go to like a botanical gardens, like where they have all those trees, and then
I
it used to
think
be a
DC
yearly thing.
also has some.
Mm. Well, I mean, I could definitely see that. But what would happen is that during the Sakura Matsuri, there'd actually be like huge Japanese festivals that would take place in these in these little areas, and then we'd back when they still would happen often, we would we would go pretty much every year, and like we'd see like traditional performance of like taiko and like traditional flute performances and oh, what else was there? And of course they would also have like your punk J rock whatever at the. It was basically kind of like a collection of Japanese culture, and we'd go every year.
Okay. So I've got a follow-up question. We've talked about the things that you do relate to,
Mm.
but what about the things that you don't relate to as part of your biculturalism from either like your mom's side or your dad's side? Are there things that you just don't relate to?
Um, at least on the Japanese side, I definitely feel that there is it's kind of well known that there is a culture of conformity,
Hmm.
and one thing I de- and like just like there's entire phrases that like kuki o yomu or like that kind of thing. And the thing is that like of course like everybody does that to some extent, even Americans. It's not like this culture doesn't exist, but I don't feel like I would personally thrive in an environment that would be that where that culture is that strong, where you constantly where you don't feel like you can be your authentic self because you have to constantly worry about fitting in with other people. Um, but I guess if we go to the American side, like one thing that I like I really like the phrase, the Japanese phrase, at least because it gives actual words to it, like meiwaku kakeru, which is means to like cause trouble, to cause nuisance to somebody else. And you notice a lot with a certain, well, not everyone, of course, but it's far more common for people to say, litter litter, or not hold the door for somebody. I mean, depending where you live, of course, but
So you're from the Northeast, right?
yeah,
So I feel like as a Southerner, we hold doors and we don't litter, but
yeah.
I definitely can see it if you're from like different parts of the U.S. for sure.
Yeah. And also, of course, like if you're on public transit and people are just blasting their music without headphones, I mean, of course, that's going to be no, I don't know anybody that would
We
like
don't
that, but
have public transit in the South, sadly. So
I see.
yeah,
And of
but
course,
I
that's
think
not,
it's
yeah.
yeah. So definitely, different parts of the U.S. have their own culture, I think,
Mm.
and maybe as a Northeasterner, that sort of colors your view of things. But it sounds to me like you're saying that generally, where you're from in the States, people don't have that mentality of I'm not going to cause a problem, even if it's a minor thing like holding their trash until they find a trash bin.
Yeah. I mean, luckily, most people, what's a good way of saying this? I mean, most people know, just in like not just like, oh, I'm done with the straw, just throw it into the street. Most people aren't like that, but it's far more common than compared to other places, like say like in the South or in Japan. So it's something that you encounter far more often, and it's just simply more that like, uh, I there's definitely ups and downsides to this, where it's like, this is, I am an individual being, therefore I'm going to live my best life, and I think that can be really good for a lot of people because it helps free them. But also sometimes they take it too far, and they realize, they don't realize that you're not alone. You live in a society. You live with people like all around you, and your actions have consequences. So of course, I think it's like the correct thing is to strike a balance between figuring out how to live like your authentic self without, you know, without necessarily like causing nuisance or causing harm to others. I think I'm pretty sure that's a pretty universal thing in general. But yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, we have these like sort of social contracts, I think. What is and isn't acceptable. And in some places, even littering is not considered unacceptable.
Mm.
It's considered the norm. And I think we were that way in the States too. I've seen the old videos from like the 1950s of like trying to get people not to litter.
Yeah.
And I think it's because it's sort of this is me talking about something I don't know much about, so I could be wrong.
Mm.
Natural stuff is okay to litter. If we didn't our caveman ancestors, if they threw a banana peel or something, it would turn in, it would go back to the environment.
Mm.
But like that doesn't happen with plastic or metal.
Yeah.
So I think it's definitely a learned behavior, and I think it changes over time. And speaking of things changing over time, how has perception of bicultural people changed in your lifetime? So like growing up versus now, do you feel like there's much of a difference?
Um, I I'd say so, since I mean, the thing is, like, I have pretty vivid memories of both, of actually even up to high school, that when people see me, they don't think, oh, this person looks mixed. They just see Asian. That's Asian is the only word that comes across most people's heads when they see me. And then, of course, when I talk about it, then it's like, oh, you're Japanese. But then the thing is, they don't think half Japanese. They just think Japanese. So there isn't a lot of nuance. But I found a lot more recently. I found recently that people, I mean, there's new words coming out, such as like Wasian, for example, which is a combination of the words white and Asian, so people are becoming a little bit more aware of this, and people are also becoming more aware of, oh, you're from this well, you're ethnically you're this, but you didn't grow up speaking, therefore you can't speak this language. So there's a little bit more of an growing understanding with it. So I definitely think that's definitely a good thing. Yeah.
Yeah, there's sort of that old timey sort of stereotype of people with Asian backgrounds being asked where they come from, and you're like, oh, I come from Washington. They're like, no, where do you really come from? And it's sort of like you see it a lot. I think there's a term for it. It's called like the perpetual foreigner,
Mm.
where people who are sort of different ethnic backgrounds are often considered foreign, even when they're not.
Yeah.
And
Actually,
for whatever reason, that happens a lot to people of Asian backgrounds
yeah.
in the States. I don't know why.
I have a very specific story about it, actually. So, one time I very specifically remember this in the ninth grade. So somebody asked, like, I think I forgot, like, basically what kind of Asian. I said, oh, just Japanese. And this person quite literally said to me, "You're Japanese? I thought you were Asian." That is a, that is a direct quote. So, I mean, it proves to show how good American education is sometimes. But
Yeah, sometimes people miss out on geography.
yeah.
Now, going forward in the future, do you have any thoughts about how society is going to keep changing with the idea of like accepting multiculturalism, accepting bicultural people, and things like that? Do you think it's going to continue to change? What are your thoughts if you were doing the forecast?
Uh, well, in America, I'm pretty sure it's that's kind of already a norm. So I don't think there's probably going to be much change there. But in
I
Japan,
think
I
it
mean,
depends on where you're from.
well, fair. Oh yeah, fair enough. I mean, just for context, I
Yeah,
live
if
in
you
New
go
York,
to
but yeah,
if you go to Kentucky or um, like Missouri or something, I imagine it's going to be quite different than in New York.
yeah, fair enough. Yeah, I mean that also greatly colors my judgment of things since New York is the norm for me. Uh,
What do you say when you're waiting and there's a line?
uh,
Do you say inline or online?
go online, go online. I say online.
You say online, you're waiting online. Yeah, you're a
Hmm.
New Yorker.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, like, if I say I'm waiting in line, it I understand that, but that feels weird to say. Yeah.
My old boss is a New Yorker, and he would always say it, and it drove me crazy because for the rest of the country, we say inline.
Oh wow. I mean, if you say
I'm
get
waiting
in,
in
if
line.
you said, well, I mean, I also realized that get online and get in line are actually mean two different things to me. Like if you say get in line, it's like you're doing something that's socially unacceptable. To stop that, to correct your behavior. But if you say get on, or no, that's for get in line. But if you say get online, that's like, bro, you're
Like,
you're
get
trying
in
to
the
skip the line,
queue.
go back. It's like,
Yeah. All right. But yeah, I think that being a New Yorker has probably colored your experiences, which is totally fine
hmm,
because being from the middle of nowhere has definitely colored mine as well. And I think even in the middle of nowhere in the South, globalism and multiculturalism is becoming harder and harder to avoid,
hmm,
even for the staunchest traditionalists,
yeah,
people who their great 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 grandpappy was from the same holler, in
yeah,
Kentucky in the
hmm,
mountains. Uh, I think even hillbillies watch anime these days.
yeah.
So
And definitely something similar is happening in Japan. I mean, to a slower extent, so like compared to America, but I mean the emergence of terms like hafu or mikusu, like that are used in Japan is also gone way up, along with words like shijo, which is essentially describing Japanese people who were born in Japan and lived in foreign countries and then came back to Japan. So I think
okay,
definitely there's like, and given the given the issue of there's not that many young people, they're gonna have to fill that labor shortage somehow, and there's probably
they've
not
been
many
doing
situ-
that. I think
yeah.
I think they've been having a lot of Vietnamese people come over.
Mm. So
Um,
whether they like it or not, they're gonna have to figure out how to fill that labor shortage somehow, and then probably the best, or not the best, but the the current best solution that most people have thought of is import more people, import foreigners, and have them do the things. And if that's going to be the future of Japan, people are going to have to get used to foreigners, whether they like it or not. So,
mm, yeah, I've heard some horror stories out of Japanese hospitals.
mm,
So in the States, even in the middle of nowhere, they have tele-translation services.
mm,
So you can be a Spanish speaker in the middle of nowhere in Idaho, and if you go to the hospital, they'll have a way of getting translation. Japan, despite being a very advanced country, does not have that, or
uh,
doesn't have it as a rule. And I taught for an A Kaiwa, and one time we were discussing how something like deaths were like 60 or 70% higher for foreigners in Japanese hospitals.
yeah.
Um,
I mean, I could definitely imagine that. Yeah.
yeah, so it's sort of a globalism is happening, multiculturalism is happening, and there are downsides definitely, I think, to being totally foreign, especially if you don't speak the language.
Mm, mm,
Now, I think that this was a great little interview. Before we go,
Mhm.
Isaac, is there anything that we didn't touch on that you'd like to talk about?
Uh, I I think we've covered our bases pretty well.
All right. So the moral of the story, do you have a moral for us?
Uh, uh, I think when it comes to learning, I think learning language, of course, learn languages. That's a very good thing, and it helps you learn like new culture, learn about new cultures. But also, don't go too strong in any one direction. Find what works for you personally. You know, what's it called? There are always going to be benefits and downsides to everything. So figure out that balance that works for you. So I'd say that's pretty important.
All right. And Isaac, thank you for coming on. And guys, I'll see you next week. I want to thank you for listening to this episode of the Refold Podcast. If you're watching the live premiere, you're in luck. Right as it ends, we have an after party over on the Refold Central Discord server. Come join us by using refold.link/join to chat about the episode. If you enjoyed the podcast and would like to hear more, you can find older episodes to listen to on YouTube and Spotify. Let us know what you thought about the video by liking and leaving a comment below. Do you have suggestions for upcoming visitors or requests for particular topics? Please feel free to reach out to me on Discord at GeorgePig #5413 or via email at clayton@refold.la. Thank you all for watching and or listening, and I'll see you next week.